Y'all, when I tell you that I, Tonya is one of my all-time favorite movies, I do not put that lightly. I, Tonya, a 2017 film directed by Craig Gillespie and produced by Barbie herself, explores the trials and tribulations of former figure skater Tonya Price, formerly known as Tonya Harding. The film opens by telling us that this story is based on irony-free, wildly contradictory, totally true interviews with Tonya Harding and Jeff Gillooly. Before we can hear Tonya speak, we hear from Jeff, her ex-husband, her mother LaVonna, who is accompanied by her pet bird, whom she refers to as her sixth husband. We meet her coach Diane, who describes Tonya as totally American. We hear the late Sean Eckhart in an interview taped before his death confess that Jeff and Tonya originally wanted to take out Nancy Kerrigan, and it was he who suggested that there were other, maybe less extreme ways of disabling people. From there, we meet Martin Maddox, who is what they call a composite character. He is meant to represent a reporter from the very real but canceled tabloid TV program Hard Copy. Tonya lights up before telling us she had no shame in being a redneck, and then proudly states that she was the first U.S. woman to land a triple axel. So fuck 'em. The movie I, Tonya is meant to be a mockumentary. The film is interspliced with clips from the interviews of the main key players, who all played a pivotal role in Tonya's life. Even Martin Maddox, our fictional hard copy reporter, played a hand in the Tonya Harding spectacle. He tells us that while the more legitimate news outlets looked down on them, it didn't take long for them to stoop to their level. Once we flash back to Tonya's childhood, we get a glimpse into the dysfunctional and abusive relationship between her and her mother. Tonya loved skating, and her mom knew that from the time she was a child. She pushed Tonya to be a great skater, but her methods often involved physically and verbally abusing her. But LaVonna has no shame about this. She justifies her abuse of Tonya as something Tonya needed in order to be great. If LaVonna wasn't there to tell her she couldn't do it, Tonya wouldn't have the motivation to prove her wrong. When Tonya becomes an adult and one abusive incident goes too far, she decides to move in with her boyfriend Jeff, who in the interview says he was elated because he wanted to protect her. The only problem is Jeff was also abusing her. Jeff denies this, and while the movie presents both sides and gives each of them a chance to comment on what the other has said, we are still meant to empathize with Tonya more than Jeff. This is her story, even if the others contradict hers. We mostly hear from Tonya and Jeff, and it's their voices that are leading us through this story. But Tonya's is still the dominant storyteller. Tonya, whose life was basically ruined after her ex-husband and his friend Sean decided to plan an attack on Nancy Kerrigan, gets to look directly into the camera and tell us all how we aided in ruining her. I, Tonya is not a perfect film. While I love it and I always enjoy rewatching it, it's not perfect. Nothing is. But while it's not perfect, it knows to some degree what narrative it is presenting. It jumps back and forth between Tonya and Jeff's recollections of the events, but it still has a consistent theme in mind. It focuses solely on Tonya's story, not even bothering to turn this into a story about Nancy and Tonya. For the first time, Tonya gets to be heard, and we get to see why we were wrong about her. I, Tonya doesn't shy away from accurately depicting the cycle of abuse. It does not hesitate to condemn the media for their part in Tonya's downfall. And in the end, Tonya tells us exactly what we are meant to take away from this movie.
America, they want someone to love, but they want someone to hate.
When this movie first came out, I'd only recently learned of Tonya Harding's existence. I loved watching documentaries when I was younger, and I especially enjoyed the Hollywood Biography Channel celebrity documentaries. Not because I was obsessed with celebrities necessarily, but because I'm nosy, and I liked hearing about the drama and problems going on in the lives of people I didn't know. I also loved the 90s, not because the 90s were great, they weren't, but because I really liked a lot of TV shows and movies from that decade. The Reels channel had these two shows that I would watch religiously. One called Murder Made Me Famous, and the other called Scandal Made Me Famous. Two shows that covered the infamous scandal and murder cases of the 80s and 90s. These shows are where I learned about Amy Fisher, Lorena Bobbitt, Anna Nicole Smith, the prom mom, the Unabomber, and Tonya Harding. The Tonya Harding episode was just as harsh and critical of Tonya as the media had always been up to that point. I didn't realize that by the time I'd learned of her existence was right around the time Tonya Harding was about to get her redemption arc. It wasn't long after seeing this episode that news of a biopic about Tonya Harding starring Margot Robbie had been circulating the internet, and I was very excited to see it. The thing about biopics is that they're hit and miss. I've always had a complicated relationship with biopics in the same way I do with musicals. I like the idea of them more than I actually like most of the ones that are actually produced. I can name on one hand how many musicals I like in the same way I could with biopics. There's only a select few that manage to be well cast, well written, and entertaining, but even the small amount that are actually good, there's always something. Right? Anytime a biopic or bioseries comes out or is about to come out, we get articles telling us all the things we need to know about the real story before watching the dramatized version. And then once the dramatized version has reached audiences, we get articles telling us all the things that dramatization got right and what it got wrong. Sometimes we get stories about how people who the film is depicting were not consulted during the making of said film or TV show. Sometimes even the main subjects that the film or TV show is centered on is condemned by the very person it was meant to portray in a more positive light. There have always been ethical problems with biopics. Biopics profit from a real person's hardships in life and often don't have full consent from the person or group they are making a film about. There is a fine line between exploitation and a tribute when creating a biopic, and Hollywood often has a difficult time not crossing the line. Society has done its part in idolizing celebrities to the point of making them feel larger than life, no longer a regular person. People often don't see what's wrong with biopics when the subjects of the movies are about public figures, but they deserve privacy like anyone else does. There are countless biopics that were created after the subject of the film had passed, never giving them the ability to consent to having their lives broadcast for people to watch for entertainment. But you already knew that. The thing about I, Tonya is, Steven Rogers, a screenwriter, took it upon himself to contact both the real Tonya Harding and Jeff Gillooly, and much of the script is based on their contradictory accounts of the events. Tonya Price loves I, Tonya, and why wouldn't she? She's being played by Margot fucking Robbie. What better way to clap back than to be played by one of the most beautiful and beloved actresses in Hollywood at the moment? Not only that, but this movie was finally able to, at least for the most part in terms of the incident, it was able to set the record straight. As Sarah Marshall beautifully recounts the story in an amazing piece for The Believer, after the attack against Nancy took place, the story of how it all went down had gone through the old 90s telephone machine. People would often retell this story with Tonya being the attacker, and the weapon being anything other than what it actually was. A police baton. To the public, her injury had already been transformed into a gangland kneecapping, while the assailant's weapon, revealed soon after the assault to have been a collapsible police baton, was routinely characterized as everything but a crowbar, a wrench, a lead pipe, and an ongoing public game of Clue. But Tonya wasn't the attacker. The attacker was a man named Shane Stant. Shane Stant was a friend of Sean Eckhart, who was a longtime friend of Jeff Gillooly. It was they who planned the attack, and it was they who pled guilty to the assaults. But it didn't matter. From the time Nancy Kerrigan was attacked to the time it reached mainstream media, the narrative was already forming and cementing itself into the culture. Tonya Harding, whether she was the assailant or not, asked her boyfriend and his friend to help her take out her competition. Her competition, who served as the more graceful and elegant image the Figure Skating Association wanted. Tonya wasn't able to provide this image for them. She was a poor tomboy with a dysfunctional family and an absentee father. She wasn't able to afford the kinds of fancy costumes that would appease judges. At the time, this was what Tonya was lambasted for. Nancy was seen as classy, as Tonya was seen as white trash. She was trash. Trash cheats. Trash wants reward without working. Trash is dangerous. Trash doesn't care about other people's dreams. Why question a story that made such easy sense and provided so much to laugh at along the way?
This is the thing. Like, Nancy has, like, exactly the right kind of misfortune for, like, TV to understand.
I mean, the whole thing is, like, there's certain kinds of hardship that we're willing to recognize and certain kinds of hardship that we're not.
And one of the other things Tonya talks about a lot in the Tonya tapes is, like, a longtime friend of hers who raped her.
Oh, God.
And she was like, and I didn't tell the police. And the interviewer was like, why? And she's like, well, I was the national champion at the time. Like, I couldn't tell anyone. It would be shameful.
I mean, to some extent, she's right.
Yeah, that's the thing. She is right.
Yeah.
She is right about how the world would respond to that. That's the terrible. They would use that as evidence of her being trashy somehow, that she was a victim of rape. I mean, because she alleged terrible domestic abuse against Jeff. She said he did awful things to her, and that was available to anyone who was interested in listening at the time that everyone was writing these articles about, like, the mystery of what happened.
Yeah.
And the only time people mention it, for example, in a Rolling Stone article in 1994, is like, what a trashy national champion. She had this hair and this eye makeup, and she filed a restraining order against her husband. Like, what a trashy thing to do. And it's like, this is how we talked about people in America.
Right.
Like, what a trashy thing to do to, like, have an abusive husband.
Right.
Like, what the fuck is that?
I, Tonya not only condemns the media, but it also shines a light on the snobbish elitism of the Figure Skating Association. And highlighted how no matter what Tonya did, no matter how well or not she skated, it was never going to measure up to Nancy's ability to play along. The movie does a very good job of presenting this to us. Steven Rogers said he wanted to share multiple perspectives. He wanted to tell both Tonya and Jeff's side of the story and wanted the audience to come to their own conclusion. But even then, we still end with Tonya telling us,
everyone has their own truth, and life just does whatever the fuck it wants. And that's the fucking truth.
But how much of Tanya's truth is revealed in this movie? See, I, Tonya isn't a perfect film, as I have already stated. It's a great movie that still suffers from the inherent problems with biopics and the selective storytelling it often engages in. The movie depicts the physical abuse Tonya suffered at the hands of her mother and ex-husband. The movie does a great job of showing us the sweetness and tenderness of their awkward young love, while alongside it, portraying his short-tempered and violent outbursts that felt all too familiar to Tonya. The scenes are rough and hard to watch. The scene of him punching her and then throwing the lettuce almost always catches me by surprise every time I watch this movie. It never fails to make me angry and leave a pit in my stomach. But despite the fact that the movie doesn't shy away from showing what Tonya has always claimed Jeff did to her and what Jeff has always denied, it still doesn't show the full extent of what Tonya endured in that marriage. In a book titled The Tonya Tapes, written by Linda Prowse, which consisted of a collection of interviews with Tonya Harding, Tonya alleges that the abuse she endured from Jeff was much worse than what we actually see in the movie. There are scenes of him confronting her with a gun and threatening to shoot her, and another where she locks the door as he bursts into the home and tries to confront her. But there aren't any scenes of Jeff allegedly allowing two men and himself to rape Tonya at gunpoint in order to keep her quiet about the planned attack against Nancy. There aren't scenes of him apparently chasing her as she feared for her life down a dark road. We see a scene of Tanya's half-brother groping her and her beating him with a hairdryer, in a moment we are meant to find comical. But in reality, her half-brother attempted to rape her and her mom pressured her not to say anything to the police. We don't hear about the sex tape that Jeff allegedly leaked to the media, which today would be called revenge porn. What we see and what we hear is Jeff portraying himself as this sweet, supportive boyfriend, this sad sap who made Tonya peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. We hear him claim that it was Tonya who hit him and aimed a gun at him. And we're meant to feel some pang of sadness when in their final scene together, she tells him he should just unalive himself as he breaks down and sobs against the door.
So to refer to the Tonya tapes, Linda Prowse, the interviewer, says, so you really loved him? You were head over heels? And this is after they get engaged. And Tonya says, well, I thought so then, but when I look back now, I was stupid. He used to beat me all the time. He would get pissed off and he'd beat me. He would go out with the guys and I would stay home. He wouldn't take me out. And Linda says, this was after you were married? And she says, yes, but even before. What was I thinking then? Being stupid and young and naive. My mom hit me and she loved me. He hits, he loves me. It's just the way life goes. He's a man. That's how it goes.
Jesus.
From the way she describes it here, it feels like she doesn't see it as like anything worth complaining about, really.
Yeah. This is what love is. This is what men are.
Yeah. And then later she says, once we moved in together, he became very abusive. One of the things I find frustrating about it is that it does this kind of he said, she said with her abuse allegations, where it's like, Jeff says he didn't abuse Tonya at all. And we're going to show you, it does this thing like Clue. And so they do Jeff's version where he never laid a hand on her. Jeff Gillooly couldn't hurt a fly. And then they do Tanya's version where it's like, he abused me. But it's like they show her getting hit a couple times. Mm-hmm. They show her like Jeff, backhanding her in the face, I think, which is awful and which no one should do. But if you're going to do, his allegations, her allegations, I see no reason to not show what she really alleges, which is that he was chasing her down a dark road in a truck while she was running away from him, and then she running through the forest in Keds.
Right.
What she's claiming is that he was a terrifying force in her life.
Right.
And if we're doing he said, she said, then let's do the she said.
Right.
If this movie is meant to be a both sides of the story retelling, then why are we not seeing all of Tanya's side? Whether or not you believe these accounts, this is her version of the event. So why are these egregious details not being included? Why is her attempted rape by her brother watered down to make us laugh rather than cry. The movie seems to omit these specific details of Jeff in order to appease both parties to some degree. It treats Jeff's word to be almost as valid as Tonya's word, despite the fact that Jeff himself is not exactly the most trustworthy source. He has always vehemently denied being abusive towards her, but Tonya, along with friends and family members, attest to the abuse. We also never hear any of the people interviewed speak to this in any way. It all comes from Tonya. There is another problem with the way this movie decides to depict even the forms of abuse it wants to show. As noted by Brandon Katz in an article for The Observer, they ask, why does I, Tonya, want us to think domestic violence is hilarious? As much as that scene in the kitchen infuriates me, and as much as it succeeds in making you despise Jeff, many of their violent encounters are accompanied by upbeat rock music and one sad love ballad, which is actually a cover of the famous Bee Gees song, How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? Even the scenes where LaVonna beats Tonya with a hairbrush or kicking her to the ground as she is sitting in a chair are spliced together in a montage as rock music plays over it. The movie may not want us to side with Tanya's mother, and in that diner scene actually does a great job of showcasing why LaVonna is the way she is.
I made you a champion, knowing you'd hate me for it. That's the sacrifice a mother makes. I wish I'd had a mother like me instead of nice. Nice gets you shit. I didn't like my mother either, so what? I fucking gave you a gift.
But we are almost always meant to laugh at LaVonna's accounts as a bird sits on her shoulder. Tonya gets a lot of credit for not shying away from the uglier aspects of her life. But is it ever okay to treat trauma as a punchline? Why celebrate such behavior? Taxi Driver is a classic, but there's no denying that Travis Bickle is a rage-fueled delusional stalker. Don Draper is arguably television's greatest anti-hero, but he's also an alcoholic womanizer, willing to abandon his children at a moment's notice. Janny is unforgettable in I, Tonya, but her horrendous character is the main source of comic relief. How do we reconcile that? How do we enjoy an otherwise really good movie with those thoughts gnawing at our conscience? Stephen and Craig wanted the movie to vacillate between the darkness and the comedic nature of this entire incident. They wanted the movie to be honest and raw and at times hard to watch, but still entertaining and fun. That fact is accentuated by the incredible soundtrack. But what does this do for Tonya? This movie did redeem the image of Tonya Harding. She was Margot Robbie's date to the Golden Globes, she was back skating again, and she even got a piece in the New York Times declaring that Tonya Harding would like her apology, please. And as I said before, Tonya loves this movie and is happy that it exists, but it unfortunately doesn't tell her entire side of what actually happened, and it just doesn't make sense. Omitting the details of the sexual harassment and abuse that she suffered is not right. That should have been included in the movie. The movie shows Jeff being violent while also on some level portraying him as a pathetic loser who we should feel sorry for to some degree, despite the fact that he has allegedly done things to Tonya that would probably make it difficult to present him in this way convincingly if they were included. The movie still wants to entertain, it still wants you to have fun, and that would ruin the fun. The movie wants you to constantly see Tonya as this tough badass who doesn't let anything get her down. Even when Jeff is abusing her, we almost never see the actual aftermath. We don't see how much pain this caused her or how scared she was of him. He literally shoots at her and it ricochets into her head, and she still upholds this tough exterior as if she's not only unsurprised but unfazed.
We can't have a major social movement that doesn't overly simplify some things, and I think that the main thing that I didn't see in I, Tonya that I feel like is part of her story, and to me an important part of her story, is that like she wasn't always spunky and cute and able to stick up for herself and someone who is easy to see yourself as. You know, she wasn't always just the spunky outsider. Mm-hmm. She's someone whose life bore the scars of the abuse that she had suffered.
Mm-hmm. I think Margot's performance is amazing, and this is actually the movie that turned me into a Margot Robbie fan. But it would have been nice to see Tonya being vulnerable. In an article for The Baffler, my favorite word, Sarah Marshall wrote an article on I, Tonya after its release. She, as many others did at the time, compares the film's stylistic choices with that of Goodfellas. It's difficult to fault a movie for having too much Scorsese DNA, and yet, if I, Tonya has a single fatal flaw, it's this. It tries too hard to make the story go down too painlessly, and it does the job well. Goodfellas is a counterintuitively easy movie to watch in a way that can hardly escape the viewer's notice. You witness whacking after whacking, until it's hard to view murder as anything but a kind of slapstick, as its protagonists generally do. I, Tonya is also, for all its violence, an easy movie to watch. The question is whether this keeps it from telling its story. Later in the article, she criticizes the movie's representation of Jeff and Tanya's relationship. We see her subjected to violence, but always having enough violent force of her own to keep herself safe. We are never given the chance to feel afraid for her, or with her. By claiming to give us both versions of the story, I, Tonya gives us no version at all. Now, what does this have to do with Ryan Murphy?
And the consciousness is obsessed with this story. And you talked about people's perceptions and responses. Erik, of course, has responded from prison. Javier, what are your thoughts on him calling the project inaccurate?
Well, I think it's absolutely legitimate for him to express and have an opinion, of course. And I totally respect that. We totally respect that. And we support whatever he wants to think about it because it's his life.
What is the point of biopics? It seems every year when a new biopic or bio miniseries is released, there are articles and hot takes questioning the genre's relevancy and validity. Critics of the genre pretty much make the same arguments, that biopics are easy awards contenders. They're easy to write and produce because the story is essentially written for you, and most of them, even the ones who have won awards, are almost immediately forgotten the minute the actor walks off stage with their Oscar. In a 2023 article from Highbrow magazine titled Ordinary to Extraordinary Lives, biopics continue to captivate film fans. Writer Angelo Franco writes, "There are certain elements about biopics that make them irresistibly predictable, much to the adoration of viewers that sometimes clamor for an easy popcorn-popping movie experience amid all the Oscar baits. It might be the classic underdog trope, the dramatic transformation montages, or the tear-jerking third-act redemption. It's a recipe that filmmakers have been following for decades to such precision that the formula has even been the focus of parody. This is one of the reasons that biopics can have a bit of a bad rep. Oftentimes they serve as vehicles for an endless parade of A-list actors chasing an Oscar that they'll gladly don prosthetic noses, wear bald caps, or lose 50 pounds in the name of method acting. And generally, biopics gravitate towards the most average approach of storytelling. In 2015, journalist Bilga Abiri, in an article for Vulture, begged Hollywood to stop making so many biopics. Biopics are endemic to Hollywood, but now they've become epidemic. It's hard to sort out the biopics opening in a given week, let alone a year. And when we put together, a kind of sameness starts to emerge. Biopics often have their own rhythm, a certain and then quality, and they turn on a kind of predictability. We know, for example, that very often they're leading to a big speech or a big historical denouement, with obligatory nods to other historical or biographical details along the way, even if those details are irrelevant to the ostensible plot. In the header for a 2008 article from The Guardian written by Gareth McLean says, "The biopic seems torn between the obligation to cover pivotal moments from the life of a historical figure and the artistic necessity to depart from fact and explore a character." This pretty much sums up every biopic or bio-series ever made, and this is often cited as the reason for its controversies. Needless to say, biopics are a very fraught genre, with few exceptions. Some of what we consider the best movies of all time are biopics like Goodfellas, The Wolf of Wall Street, The Social Network, What's Love Got to Do with It, and The Temptations, just to name a few. I think what separates these films from most biopics is that people don't just see these movies as biopics, they see them as good movies. The Temptations is a pretty paint-by-numbers biopic, and it's very predictable, yet it's a classic in the Black community. If you've ever heard a Black person say,
"Ain't nobody coming to see you, Otis,"
that's where they got it from. The Temptations, I feel, is special not because of its formulaic plot, but because of its performances. Leon as David Ruffin is iconic, even if the way he is written is a little cliche at times. His portrayal of him sticks in your head. Plus, it's Leon, who is beautiful.
What a beautiful chocolate man!
The chemistry between the actors and how well they were able to embody the real Temptations can make anyone who has never even heard of them before a Temptations fan. What's Love Got to Do with It does something similar in my opinion. While Tina Turner famously did not like this biopic and didn't like how it portrayed her as a victim, I can't deny that it's one of my favorite movies of all time. And Angela Bassett is incredible in it. Lawrence Fishburne as Ike Turner is scary in a way that makes you slightly afraid of the actor himself, much like Danny Glover as Mr. from The Color Purple. Angela Bassett as Tina Turner, as with Ray Liotta as Henry Hill, and Margot Robbie as Tonya Harding, all have one thing in common. They play these real-life subjects so well that you sometimes forget that these are even based on real people. They all embody these roles in a way that doesn't feel like it's just an impersonation of a real person. I feel like one of the biggest problems with biopics today is that they're more focused on making the actor look and sound exactly like the real person, and neglecting to make us care about them as a character. Goodfellas and I, Tonya and The Wolf of Wall Street, I suppose, although not my favorite movie, are considered exceptional because of the way the story is constructed and the narrative we are meant to take away from it. One of the biggest problems with biopics that eventually become forgotten, like Being the Ricardos, fucking hate that movie, is because they're more focused on recreating classic moments in a classic sitcom, or putting the actor in the exact outfits the real person wore, rather than creating an interesting story and a message, a reason as to why we're even watching it. But still, the question remains. What is the point of biopics? Especially when, like I just said, people are constantly making the same critiques of the genre and nothing seems to be getting better and are arguably getting worse. Which brings us to Netflix's Monsters, the Lyle and Erik Menendez story. Despite the laughable contrast between the actors and the real-life subjects, it is mostly well cast. The first episode, Blame It on the Rain, opens in 1989 with the brothers heading to their parents' funeral. Lyle, played by Nicholas Chavez, is erratic but cool and collected, while Erik is hysterical and guilt-ridden. This is where the show officially establishes that the brothers are polar opposites. Lyle tells him to suck it the fuck up and
do not act like a goddamn pussy.
But Erik doesn't suck it the fuck up. After the funeral, Erik, who is anxious and on edge, calls his therapist, Dr. Ozio, and asks for an impromptu session. They talk in his office for a bit before going on a walk, where Erik confesses that they did it.
We did it, my brother and I.
You shot them.
Dr. Ozio brings him back to the office and asks him what could have driven them to do such a thing. Erik cites the 1987 film The Billionaire Boys Club as what prompted them to plan this double parricide. He also describes his father as domineering with a short temper. We see a flashback of Jose yelling at Lyle for not knowing how to pronounce a certain word and smashing his dinner plate against the wall. We see a scene of Kitty and Jose prohibiting Lyle from getting married at such a young age. Lyle calls her a hypocrite because she and Jose got married when they were young as well. And Kitty decides to humiliate him by snatching off his toupee, as Erik looks on in bewilderment. Erik goes to talk to Lyle, who is obviously upset, and has a meltdown in front of Erik, who in present day tells Dr. Ozio that this was what made him realize how cruel their home life was, but doesn't reveal the entirety of their conversation. Dr. Ozio asks why they killed their mother, and Erik says they wanted to put her out of her misery. Dr. Ozio suggests they call Lyle, who is livid after he informs him that Erik told him everything. Before Lyle arrives at the office, we see Dr. Ozio sprint to a payphone and call his mistress/client, Judalon Smith. He practically demands her to come to his office right now so that she can be a witness. Judalon reluctantly shows up and meets Lyle in the waiting room. Lyle bursts through the door and asks Erik what he told him. Dr. Ozio tries to intervene, but Lyle yells at him to shut the fuck up. Lyle and Erik have a back and forth where Lyle tries to paint Erik as a liar who made this entire thing up, but eventually he relents. Dr. Ozio tells them that he could be their lifeline. He could testify on their behalf if they end up in court. He denies his offer, and Lyle asks what he's gonna do now that he has this information. Dr. Ozio says nothing, and they leave. Lyle confronts Erik in the car as Erik sulks. Lyle says they have to kill him now, and then they drive off into the end credits. The first 5 episodes, at least for the most part, centers the perspectives of Lyle and Erik. Throughout each episode, we are given a picture of a cruel and dysfunctional family, a domineering father and a mother who remains indifferent and nonchalant when watching her husband scream at her son for not knowing how to pronounce a certain word and then smashing his plate against a wall. Though we witness the parents being awful to the brothers themselves are portrayed as rich snobs who are way too excited to spend the $14 million inheritance their father left in his wake. Lyle's scenes consist of him talking at rapid speed, being overconfident, arrogant, and always on the verge of exploding, whereas Erik's scenes consist of him being more emotional and questioning his sexuality at certain moments. Through all of this, Lyle maintains that they had to die, and he reminds Erik to never forget what happened in that house. All of this leads to episode 3. For a little bit of context, Judalon, Dr. Ozio's client and mistress, feels afraid to stay at her own place and feels she should stay with him where she can be protected. He agrees, but after she says some weird shit to his daughter,
If I was your mommy, I'd let you have treats whenever you'd like.
he kicks her to the curb. This causes her to snitch on him about everything Dr. Ozio told her, including the fact that he secretly began recording his sessions with the brothers who continued to see him and talk to him about what they'd done. Once the police get a hold of the tapes, they arrest the brothers and they are brought to jail. While eating lunch in jail, Lyle tells Erik he has to eat, but he's disgusted by the food and will only drink milk. He notices a black man staring at him and begins to feel nervous. This leads into a 3-minute montage where Erik continues to collect milk cartons and store them in the toilet where he can keep them cold, and Lyle making a bunch of phone calls and trying to get dimes. It's meant to be comical, but it disrupts the tone of the first 2 episodes. This episode also introduces us to Leslie Abramson, played by Ari Greener, and once she's introduced, you realize the first half of this episode was filler, because it starts to feel cohesive again when she begins talking to Erik. This episode ends with Erik revealing that their father sexually abused them. The scenes of Erik and Lyle describing their abuse are very well acted, and I appreciate them not depicting any of those memories. But something is just off. The show is beautifully shot, the costumes are great, the sets are really nice, the actors are gorgeous, and the writing is compelling enough to keep me watching. But as I kept watching, the show started to lose me little by little. When I began watching the first episode and we see that shot of Lyle getting out of the shower, holding his dick with a towel as his brother sits on the toilet, I knew it was about to be some shit. My uneasy feelings were confirmed when in the second episode, we see Lyle put his hands around Erik's neck and then kiss him on the mouth. I thought, okay, maybe I'm tripping. Maybe that's it. They're not going to keep implying that they were incestuous, right? Nope, they just keep doing it. We see them dancing all sexy together at a party. We see them soaping up each other's bodies while in the shower. Ryan claims these scenes are just a reenactment of the theories people had around the brothers at the time. But I don't think that's why these scenes are here. 23 minutes into episode 3, before we meet Leslie, the prison guards find a note Lyle sent to Erik with an escape plan, which involves them getting plastic surgery and donning these long-haired wigs. Out of all the articles I read for this show, hardly anyone brings this scene up, and when I first watched this episode, it was so far out of left field that I couldn't stop staring at the screen. These scenes are here for the purpose of being shocking and comical, but it does not work with this show at all. It felt so random. It's incredibly dark and graphic for the most part, but then they try to introduce humor in a way that just doesn't feel natural. He says that he wanted to go for a Rashomon approach, but it doesn't work here in the same way as I, Tonya, because I, Tonya was a satirical mockumentary, and Monsters isn't. Speaking of scenes that are dumb, gee, the writers were really proud of themselves for that Friends joke, huh?
Not.
Friends, that's the name of it?
Yes, that's the name of it.
That is the dumbest fucking title I've ever heard. No one.
I'm sorry, at the risk of repeating myself, what in the fuck kind of lame-ass title is Friends? Who's gonna watch something called Friends, Erik?
Craig, you're one of the co-authors of Friends, aren't you? Not the hit TV show on NBC.
See, the real-life Erik Menendez wrote a script called Friends in 1988, I believe, with his friend, which is about a son who kills his dad, and because it was written before the actual show Friends aired on television, they keep making cheeky references to it in a way that is so fucking lame. The 5th episode, The Hurt Man, is the last well-written episode of the season. It is literally all one shot that lasts about 30 to 35 minutes. In it, Erik describes to Leslie the excruciating details of the essay he suffered. From the beginning, the show portrayed Lyle as more of the mastermind. He's written to be very apathetic, conniving, and manipulative. He is also cold-hearted and callous. He bosses his brother around and at times will mock his sensitivity and shame him for acting like a girl. He is an arrogant, rich snob, and while they sometimes want us to empathize with him, it's hard to know exactly how they want us to feel about him. When we see him crying in episode 4, describing his father's abuse, are we supposed to cry with him? Or am I supposed to think he's faking it like he did in episode 2?
I just want to make sure that there aren't any dirty pictures or anything because I don't want my mother to be humiliated anymore, Uncle Brian.
Sometimes it felt like the show wanted us to hate Lyle to some degree. Now, to be fair, Erik and Lyle definitely did some things. They did lie to the police after the murders and said the mob might have killed their parents, and Lyle did ask his girlfriend to testify on their behalf by lying about Jose trying to SA her. He also asked his friend Brian to lie on the stand for him. I don't think this means they're lying about being abused by their parents. I'm just saying that they did do some shady stuff, and acknowledging that does not necessarily mean you should discount their claims. But I think Ryan uses that as a way to play into this idea of Lyle being this heartless, compulsive liar who will do whatever he can to get out of trouble. You see later on in the season Jose advising his sons to lie, cheat, and steal, but to never get caught. And I think we're supposed to think about that in conjunction with all the scenes where he talks about the abuse. As I was rewatching these episodes for this video, the show felt more and more like a jumbled mess. Ryan Murphy, the creator of this series obviously, says that they wanted to explore everyone's perspective, that including the late real-life Vanity Fair reporter Dominic Dunn's theory that the brothers' testimony about being SA'd by their dad was really just a cover-up for their secret incestuous relationship. This is presented in episode 7, Showtime, where Dominic shares his theory with other journalists at the dinner table, which is where 98% of his scenes are taking place. I wasn't able to find any concrete evidence that the real Dominic Dunn theorized this. Some articles say he did, and some articles say he didn't. Whether he did or didn't, why is this incestuousness being portrayed just because it was a rumor? The inclusion of these scenes that allude to something more aren't really adding anything to the story. They don't serve anything to the overall narrative or lack thereof. Weirdly, in a Radio Times interview with the cast, Nathan Lane, who plays Dominic Dunn, said that Dominic was just stating a theory and that it's nothing but a theory. And that's so interesting, right? Because that's total bullshit. If he theorized this because of Lyle and Erik's testimony about being SA'd by their dad, and Lyle admitting to SAing Erik and then apologizing to him for it on the stand. This theory that may have been prevalent at the time of the case is born from homophobia. It's conflating SA with sexuality. It's implying that because these men may have been SA'd by other men, that's the same as being gay, when sexual abuse and rape are not about sexuality, they're about power. Now, does the show touch on this at all? Do they make that clear when presenting this theory? No. That's why Nathan Lane is just brushing it off as just a theory. A film theory. It's why Ryan doesn't even have anything interesting to say about it other than just saying, oh, well, it was a theory that was floating around and we had a moral obligation to show it. I might be paraphrasing a little. I don't think we're meant to agree with Dominic Dunn. In fact, the show kind of mocks him a lot and writes him in this very cartoonish way. But the problem is this incest theory didn't just exist within this scene. It's something we see sprinkled throughout each episode. To repeat, Lyle literally kisses Erik on the mouth in episode 2. This along with the fact that the actors playing them, while good actors, are also extremely conventionally hot. When you see them being sexual and sensuous with each other, it feels like Ryan just wanted to show two hot actors being sexy together. The show leans into this gay theory very heavily with Erik. The black man in the cafeteria who is staring at him is revealed to be gay, and later when we see them in the shower room together, they both just stare at each other and then turn towards each other and look at each other's dicks. Erik has never explicitly said he was gay. He said on the stand that sometimes when his father would SA him, he would orgasm, and that was confusing to him. Again, using that for the basis of this portrayal is just so fucking weird. Like, why would you do that? If this was a fictional character, I'd be totally fine with it. These men are very attractive, and I love gay shit just as much as the next person. But Erik Menendez is not a fictional character, and according to him, he is not gay. I put out a poll asking you guys how you felt about this series. So far, as of this recording, only 68 of you voted. 87% of you said you hated it, 10% of you said it was okay, and a whopping 3% of you said it was good. One of the first comments noted how Ryan Murphy basically just wrote fan fiction, and I completely agree. It seems that's what this entire monster series is about. Ryan using these real life stories so he can add an American Horror Story type format to it. 2 years ago, I made a video about Dahmer Monster, the Jeffrey Dahmer story, and one of my biggest issues with that show is how much it indulges in Jeffrey Dahmer's sick fetishes and his weirdness. There are scenes of him masturbating while thinking about animal guts, and a scene of him lying on top of the man he has just murdered. The show even inserts this relationship between him and one of the men he killed, and writing his demise as a tragic love story, when in real life that doesn't appear to be how it went down. The first season spends many of its episodes exploring Jeffrey's backstory and his relationship with his parents, and how this might have led to him becoming a sexual predator / murderer / cannibal. But then in the last episode, after he has been killed in prison and they destroy his brain, the judge tells us that we can never know why Dahmer was the way he was, and we need to just accept that. Like, okay, the fuck was the point of this show then? In episode 4, Kill or Be Killed, the brothers talk about the boat trip the family took not long before the murders. During this trip, both brothers feel strongly that Kitty and Jose are planning to murder them, at one point mistaking Kitty's lipstick for a handgun. We see the brothers on the edge of the boat, where Lyle apologizes to Erik for making him feel like he couldn't come to him about the abuse from his dad. However, we don't hear the conversations happening with Kitty and Jose. Lyle tells Leslie that it was this trip that pushed them to come up with a plan to murder their parents before they murdered them. The last episode ends by returning to this boat trip. Jose is shown congratulating her along with himself for their accomplishment. We see him being supportive towards his wife and even encourages her to go back to journalism. They call for the boys to come over and Kitty asks what's going on with them. Jose says, "Who the fuck knows? Let them be." In the last shot, as Erik and Lyle sit on the edge of the boat, Erik asks Lyle if he's chickening out. Lyle says no. They both come to a decision to fucking do it. And as we fade to black and the sounds of seagulls and waves linger in the background, a title card tells us that the brothers still maintain their CSA allegations at the hands of their parents. The last episode ends, leaving us with the impression that Kitty and Jose were maybe not that bad, and that the brothers misunderstood the situation. Ryan Murphy said he included all of these perspectives because he wants us to come to our own conclusions. When asked in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter if he'd heard about the Menendez Brothers Netflix documentary that has by now already premiered on Netflix, he says, "I'm not going to watch it because I'm not interested in anything else about the Menendez Brothers. I don't want to watch the documentary. I have no interest in meeting them. I have no interest in talking to their lawyers or their wives. I've just sort of done it because I was telling a bigger story, a cultural story. I wasn't doing a biography of them. I was telling a story about a certain place and time. Listen, I'm sure they'll be thrilled with that documentary because a lot of it is supposedly in their own voices. Apparently there's new information that they claim, including about the sexual abuse from their mother, who they claim sexual abused them. The story has always fascinated people, including myself, because we'll never really know what happened. It is an unknowable mystery. There were 4 people involved in that story, and 2 of them were shot in the face. So I think that the public's fascination is limitless because there is no answer. We will never know if they told the truth. We will never know if they were sexually abused for sure. We will never know if the parents were the monsters." Okay, so So, firstly, why would you write an entire season about two people that you're not interested in? Second, what is this bigger story you wanted to tell? There is no bigger story, it's just a bunch of truths and half-truths and lies jumbled together in 9 episodes. It's very unclear what we're supposed to be taking away from any of this.
Some of the controversy of the show seems to be people thinking, for example, that the brothers are having an incestuous relationship. There are people who say that never happened. There were people who said it did happen. Dominic Dunn, who Nathan Lane plays, and we show that for the most part vis-a-vis through his theory about what happened in that house. The show is a whodunit like that. We know how it ended. We know 2 people were brutally shot. And so I think people are a little confused about what we were trying to do. Our view and what we wanted to do was present you all the facts, and at the end of it, have you do 2 things. Make up your own mind about who's innocent, who's guilty, and who's the monster. And also have a conversation about something that's never talked about in our culture, which is male sexual abuse, which we do responsibly. If you look at that show, 60 to 65% of the show centers around Erik and Lyle Menendez talking about their abuse, talking about their victimization, talking about what it emotionally put them through. Those 2 boys on our show get their moment in court and then some.
Okay, there's so many things to comment on here. Ryan says he wanted to present, quote, all the facts and allow us to make our own decision on what we believe. But that's not true. The brothers were not lovers. That was a homophobic rumor. That was not a fact. What I find so revealing in this interview is the way he just sort of eye rolls the entire thing. Things only get worse when, returning to that Hollywood Reporter interview, the interviewer asks, there has been such a reaction to monsters. Now that you have an idea of how people are consuming this series on Netflix, are you confident that by the show's end, for the people who watch all the way through, the show delivered on what you set out to do? Yes, 100%. Ian and I set out to do exactly what we wanted to do. And I'll tell you my thoughts about the Menendez brothers. The Menendez brothers should be sending me flowers. They haven't had so much attention in 30 years. And it's gotten the attention of not only this country, but all over the world. There's sort of an outpouring of interest in their lives and in the case. I know for a fact that many people have offered to help them because of the interest of my show and what we did. There's no world that we live in where the Menendez brothers or their wives or lawyers would say, you know what, that was a wonderful, accurate depiction of our clients. That was never going to happen, and I wasn't interested in that happening. The thing that the Menendez brothers and their people neglect is that we were telling a story that has a very broad canvas. We were telling the story of Dominic Dunn, of Leslie Abramson. We were also telling the story of the parents, who they blew their heads off. We were also telling their story. We had an obligation to so many people, not just to Erik and Lyle. But that's what I find so fascinating, that they're playing the victim card right now. Poor, pitiful us, which I find reprehensible and disgusting. Imagine writing and producing an entire show centered around the lives of 2 very real people who are very much alive, not contacting them beforehand, saying on record that you had no interest in speaking to them, portray them as having an incestuous relationship, and then fix your mouth to say that they should be sending you flowers for your amazing work. I can't imagine that, truly. It's reprehensible and disgusting for the brothers to be playing the victim, but what does it say about him that he's fine with taking the stories of real life people and just doing whatever he wants without thinking about the implications of that, or how that could affect the public's view of them? What does it say about him that he clearly inserted these moments because he knew it would bring attention and intrigue to the series? And what does it say about him that he cares more about that than the opinions of the people he is misrepresenting? Going back to that E! News interview with Ryan Murphy, he says towards the end that he's used to this, and
I'm used to this. I think, I write about provocative things and controversial things, and my motto is never complain and never explain. Wow. That's what I think.
Wow.
Yes, wow indeed. I don't have a problem with Ryan Murphy being provocative in his work. I actually enjoy many Ryan Murphy projects, or at least I used to. I loved American Horror Story before it went bad. I liked The People vs. OJ. I liked Feud. I mostly enjoyed Impeachment, despite the stupid fat suit Sarah Paulson had on. It was pretty good. But there is a level of disrespect in the way he has approached this story that I find to be very strange. I don't necessarily think Ryan has to believe or support them just because the consensus on the Menendez brothers has drastically shifted over the past few years, but his disregard of them and their family members who have spoken out against this season shows how Ryan views these tragedies. Nothing more than a quick way to write a series and make a shit ton of money because he knows everyone is obsessed with true crime right now. He doesn't have any strong opinions on the case, not because he is unsure of who the real monsters are, but because he doesn't really seem to give a fuck. But it's not as though Ryan Murphy is the first showrunner to do this. When it comes to biopics, there has always been some level of fan fiction inserted into these stories. Blonde is probably the worst example of this, since it's not only torture porn fan fiction, it's based on a book that is nothing but pure fan fiction. And to be clear, clear, this is not a knock at fan fiction. I don't have a problem with fan fiction as a concept. I just don't know if making fan fiction out of someone's real life story in a TV show or a movie is something we should continue to normalize. Sometimes the way certain people are portrayed in this genre has more to do with the current public's opinion of that person and not who they actually might have been. Between 1992 and 1993, there were 3 TV movies about Amy Fisher. One of them, Casualties of Love, the Long Island Lolita story starring Alyssa Milano, plays the story out more like Fatal Attraction. Joey is shown to be a loving and supportive and faithful husband, and Amy is depicted as a crazy woman who was obsessed with Joey and tried to murder his wife in the hopes that this would bring them together. When in real life, Joey was having an affair with a girl he knew was underage. He was always bitching about his wife and constantly insinuated to Amy that it would be nice if someone would just kill her. During the real-life Menendez trial in 1994, there were 2 TV movies produced based on the case, and both movies portrayed the brothers as sociopathic, greedy, spoiled assholes. That's what the public perception of them was and had always been up until recently. And the writers of these movies clearly wanted to play up those aspects. In Honor Thy Father and Mother, the true story of the Menendez murders, there's a scene of Erik praising Hitler.
You know, all great leaders had no parents. What do you mean? Hitler. Alexander the Great.
Side note, but there was also a TV movie from 1994 about Tonya Harding and Nancy Kerrigan called Tonya and Nancy that is surprisingly very nuanced and ahead of its time in terms of the way it points the finger at the media and manages to empathize with both Tonya and Nancy. Nancy is played by Heather Langenkamp from Nightmare on Elm Street, and yeah, perfect casting there. And Sean Eckhart is played by Dan Schneider. Yeah, did not see that coming. If Tanya had done an Oops All Perspectives retelling of the story, I don't think it would have been as good. We already knew what the public's opinion of Tonya Harding had been. Tanya offered something new. It made us empathize with this woman whom we had vilified for so long for very sexist and classist reasons. Monsters could have done that. It could have offered us something new, but it doesn't because this, like Dahmer, is just capitalizing off of a moment, much like Pam and Tommy and Spencer. Tanya wasn't capitalizing off a trend. In fact, the filmmakers knew they'd have to make it an indie movie if they wanted to tell the story the way they wanted to. They didn't replicate the salacious details like the Jeff and Tanya wedding sex tape that is very available on the internet, like how Pam and Tommy did. Perhaps this was due to the fact that Margot Robbie was a producer on this movie because Pamela Anderson was not given the same courtesy, and Pam and Tommy is also directed by Craig Gillespie. So yeah, he's also part of the problem. If there are rewards, and quite literally awards, given as incentive for dramatizing and sensationalizing the lives of real victims, where is the line drawn? If Murphy has appointed himself the arbiter of the controversial stories he chooses to tell, he has an obligation to both the real-life subjects and the victims of those stories. Despite Murphy's claim that the Monsters team reached out to the families of Dahmer's victims and received no response, his statement was refuted by Rita Isbell, sister to Errol Lindsay, who was killed by Dahmer in 1991. A pattern is beginning to emerge wherein Murphy co-opts a real-life tragedy and disregards the impact on said tragedy's victims, then justifies its behavior under the guise of artistic interpretation. Murphy cannot tell Variety that Monsters was the best thing that has happened to the Menendez brothers in 30 years and refuse to speak to them. Then release a series that presents a theorized incestuous relationship between 2 alleged victims of sexual assault as fact. Continuing down such a path, unearthing and reinterpreting other people's narratives, and then claiming it was done with the best intentions is irresponsible at best, and extremely shitty at worst. Pam and Tommy and Monsters almost feel like they were made just for us to finally understand how unethical biopics can be. It's like, because you're a public figure and your story has been the topic of mainstream media, anyone who wants to make a movie about you can just do that without your permission and without even contacting you. They can hire people who look almost nothing like you and create a character out of you that may or may not be accurate to who you really are. They can make money off of your story that they took and molded into something that they feel will be more entertaining to audiences. One of the themes of the season could have been about how living with an abuser who is also your parent whom you look up to can really fuck you up mentally and make you do things that seem unthinkable to some. They could have highlighted other abuse cases from that time, like the Stacey Lannert case, which was happening before the Menendez trial. Stacey Lannert, who testified to her father's physical and sexual abuse that she endured from the time she was 8 years old in 1990, shot her father twice while he was asleep. The prosecution, much like in the Menendez case, also asserted that Stacey just did this for money because she was not in any physical danger at the time of her shooting him. Lorena Gallo, formerly known as Lorena Bobbitt, famously cut off her husband John Wayne Bobbitt's penis and threw it out the window in 1993. While most mainstream media was more concerned with the fact that she had essentially cut off his manhood, according to them, Lorena testified to some very horrific physical and sexual abuse at the hands of John. People at the time felt that if she was so unhappy, she could have gone to the police or left, ignoring the fact that she had contacted the police, but nothing was done. Because, believe it or not, police are not very helpful in DV situations. People felt she did this in retaliation for him cheating on her, and because Lorena was Ecuadorian, this sort of invoked the crazy Latina stereotype. Also, she was an immigrant, and John would threaten to have her deported if she ever tried to leave him. You want to tell a cultural story, a bigger story? There's the bigger story. All these abuse cases from that time that were once viewed cynically and uncritically, to the point that these stories were the target of mockery and the center of late-night jokes. If it was so important to show the incest theory, you could have said something about that. Why did people think that? How does that relate to our attitudes around CSA and SA against men? But that's not what he did. He told a story that we already knew, and let us come to the exact same conclusion. Something that people say when addressing criticisms of these biopics or biographical miniseries is that we shouldn't look to biopics for historical accuracy. Nathan Lane, in that same Radio Times interview, says people need to understand that it's just a dramatization, not a documentary. There's a Collider article by Lloyd Farley who feels that biopics don't have to get the facts right. The writer makes the same argument that biopics are not documentaries, but also adds that a movie/TV show's job is to entertain, and the filmmakers and showrunners must condense the story and embellish upon certain details in a way that is engaging to audiences, which is true. However, like with the Jeffrey Dahmer story, these stories don't really need any embellishing. The reason these cases are so famous are because, one, they happened during a time when the obsession over public court trials that sometimes involve celebrities was at an all-time high. Two, the Dahmer case in particular happened during the stranger danger panic, and this was also, for lack of a better term, the serial killer era, which didn't end until the year 2000. Third, the details of these stories were so captivating because they felt like they were built in a lab, meant to become sensational news stories. Like their therapist was a hack who secretly recorded them and had a mistress who was also his client, who ended up testifying against him and then joked that she wouldn't want any babies that looked like him.
I would not want children that looked like Dr. Oziel.
Erik and his friend wrote a screenplay about a son who killed his father a year before they were murdered. This sounds like something out of Dynasty, and yet it actually happened. You could just tell the story as it is because it's already pretty wild. But going back to this, it's not a documentary defense. Why does the fact that it's not a documentary mean that you can just tell someone else's story however you want? No, people at home should not look to these pieces of media as documentary truth. But unfortunately, people are going to conflate these shows and movies with the real life subjects, especially if those movies and shows become extremely popular like Monsters did. Doesn't it seem a bit icky that someone could win an Oscar or an Emmy or a Golden Globe by playing a false version of someone who is still alive? One of you commented under that poll that I posted that maybe biopics shouldn't be made if the real person is still alive, and maybe they have a point. Better yet, maybe we need to just stop making biopics, period, until we can figure something out. There are, of course, many other people, like Robert Siegel, the show's creator, who helped in the making of Pam and Tommy. But it is really unfortunate that Craig Gillespie, the same man who managed to help Tonya's public image, went against the wishes of another woman whose story he produced on screen. He says in this Entertainment Weekly article that, like with Tonya Harding, he wanted to change the public's perception of Pamela Anderson, and how this sex tape that she and Tommy made was in fact stolen from them, which was contrary to popular belief at the time. What I also find frustrating about these biopics and miniseries is that the people behind these projects act like they are so concerned with telling these people's stories and pat themselves on the back for giving everyone their day in court, and yet they still leave out very important details. See, a year ago, Hulu released a documentary called Menudo plus Menendez, Voice Betrayed. In it, Roy Rosello, who was a band member of the popular 1970s Puerto Rican boy band Menudo, came forward and has alleged that Jose Menendez sexually assaulted him in their home in New Jersey when he was 13 or 14 years old. Jose was an executive producer of the record label that Menudo was under. Why would you not mention this? You had an obligation to honor the theory that Dominic Mayer may not have perpetuated, but not an obligation to Roy Rosello? That is a very important detail to leave out, especially as it pertains to the brothers' claims. And not including that is a very deliberate choice. Pam Bosnich, who was one of the prosecutors in their case, is hardly even present in the series, and why not? She said some very interesting things during that trial that should have been included and maybe would have made the story more interesting. The people who create these projects seem to teeter back and forth between wanting to be accurate but insisting that it's not a documentary, saying they have obligations to so many people, but ignoring the traumatic experiences of certain other people because it muddies your portrayal of these real-life people you've characterized. Can people tell the stories of other people without their own biases getting in the way? Can we ever learn to tell someone's story without putting entertainment over what is true for the sake of making money? And should people's stories, especially those that involve severe trauma, be used as like a cheat code for money, viewership, and prestigious awards? I don't think so. But I think we, the audience, should look inward a little. We aren't exactly innocent. We yearn for these kinds of movies and TV shows. We advocate for biopics to be made about a certain someone whose story we feel needs to be told. Why is that? Well, earlier I talked about how I used to watch biography and hour-long celebrity documentaries on E! And whatnot. What drew me to those programs is the same reason we are drawn to biopics. We're nosy. I mean, have you seen The Truman Show? That movie came out in 1998, and it has aged like fine wine. We might be part of the problem. It's not inherently bad to enjoy certain biopics or love the genre itself, like I said. I like them too. But when we complain about biopics, I think we should try to examine why these kinds of movies and shows keep falling in and out of favor and why we're still eager to see them. Ryan Murphy said that this story will always be fascinating to the public because it is an unknowable mystery, and that we'll never know who the real monster was. And while that may hold some truth, I think we all know who the real asshole is.
Whenever the financial stakes are so enormous, and in sports these days they usually are, ethics, fair play, sportsmanship, forget it. The only Olympic ideal is money. Oh, hell. We're all whores.